So we're going to have some interesting discussions on IoT with you as well. So what is your take on the whole consent issue and data exchange?
We have to sort of understand why there is a need for consent in the first place. Why do we even claim consent as a right, as a matter of right? When we say that there is certain right, then it is also understood that there is a corresponding duty on the other party. What is the corresponding duty? When you claim a certain right, the duty on the other party is to respect your right of privacy as an individual, right to privacy, right? There is a right to consent. Then there is a duty to respect your privacy on whether it be body, corporate, or whatever. And there is no dispute that that right to privacy is a fundamental right post Puttaswamy judgment. And when we claim it is a fundamental right, when we say that privacy is a fundamental right, we have to also understand that it is not a two-way affair. It's not only with respect to data controller and data principal. Even the state steps in because it is a fundamental right. When there is a fundamental right, it is the duty of the state to protect your fundamental right. When the state has been casted this duty to protect your fundamental right, what is the state going to do in this is a bigger question, right? I may say I want to actively consent to this. Well, your wish, but what is what do you do when the state itself does not want to interfere, right? So when we are talking about state and the right to privacy and things like that, the duty of the state is to put in place proper mechanism, considering while now as we all know there is this right to privacy bill which is tabled in the parliament. Even let us say, even assuming that the bill does not get passed, what are the measures that are available for the party whose right to privacy has been breached, right? Whether if it is the state or if it is the private party, if we go through the Puttaswamy judgment, I believe it is by Justice A.M. Sapre, while he is writing his judgment, and he states that this fundamental right of privacy is not only enforceable against the state, it is also enforceable against a private party, against an individual. Fundamental rights are normally enforceable against the state, but here it is also enforceable against an individual. It can be a matter of civil right. He goes on to state that. He says it can be a matter of civil right, and as a tortious claim, you can actually go and file it, right? So these are the accountability measures that can be attached to privacy principles. And consent portion with respect to the data responsibility, responsibility when it comes to data exchange is quite imperative, right? As regards IoT. Before I even talk about the different levels of consent or even the standards of consent, I feel it's even a privilege for us to even discuss about the different standards regarding consent, because as in the morning session, as you would have witnessed, that half the session was all about whether the body corporates are even take into consideration the consent portion or not, whether if they are even respecting consent or they are not respecting consent. Just to illustrate it a little further, I'll just give you certain instances, okay? And these instances are not from far away. These are experiences of my friends, right? A friend of mine in Australia, he was telling me that he was making certain inquiry about certain shipping delivery charges here in India with an Indian friend. And while he is online, while he is on phone, he is inquiring about those charges, he receives a message from a shipping company, making a specification about, what are the best shipping charges available to him, right? And there's another instance where a friend of mine, he's talking to another friend. He's not even on call, right? He's just speaking to him in person, and he's talking about this Netflix series called something called Black Mirror. And the next moment he opens Facebook, the first advertisement he sees is of Netflix showing him about Black Mirror. Wow. So basically, so it has taken that kind of dimension, whether the body corporates are even respecting the privacy or not. Whether they actually did infringe into privacy or not is another question. He will have to file a complaint, maybe there has to be an investigation and things like that. But the question whether if the consent is even being taken is open to discussion, right? But the fact that we are talking about different levels of consent is a privilege in itself, is what I'm trying to say. So before we talk about whether the consent should be passive or active, or whether should it be informed, I think I should be talking a little more about, I'll just briefly explain you what active consent means and what passive consent means, okay? Active consent is basically, an express participation, or to basically opting in to do something, right? So that is express. When do you say something as passive consent? It is when a person remains silent. Okay, I do not want to be a part of this. Either he does that or he expressly opts out of certain thing, right? So that becomes passive. So informed, it takes another tangent altogether, because when we talk about doctor-patient relationship, there's this confidentiality. A doctor explains the entire scenario or situation to the patient, right? What will happen if he undergoes a surgery. Then he explains the entire circumstance to that person, the patient, and that becomes an informed consent, whether he wants to go ahead with that surgery or not. In 90s they were talking about openness. In 90s they were talking about minimalistic approach. They were talking about the necessity principle, specific purpose principle, which are being incorporated. The similar principles are being incorporated under the data protection bill, right? So I believe, rather than leaving it upon body corporates or even the people themselves, the onus is on the government or the regulators to sort of drive the policies in such manners wherein there are certain mandates casted upon the body corporates or anybody for that matter.
Okay.
Right, and while framing the laws, we have to sort of bear in mind the social realities. For example, when we talk about mutual funds, right? You always see the disclaimer: mutual funds are subject to market risk, right? So why does that happen? Because the state takes into consideration the demography of the state, the demography of the country. The state takes into consideration the educational level of its population. The state takes into consideration the other social aspects and social realities, right? So law and society go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Right? So all the social realities have to be taken into consideration, whether a person, whether this country is literate enough to give passive consent or active consent. So all of these things have to be regarded by the state, and to determine whether the consent should be active, passive or informed is not just upon an individual. It is also the responsibility of the state to protect the right to privacy of the citizens of this country, is what my argument is.
Okay, great. And we've discussed a little bit about accountability earlier.
Right.
But what are your thoughts on, when there are data breaches, where do you think we should sort of pin the accountability?
Right. I think accountability will be certainly taken into consideration in this data protection bill when it will be legislated or enacted into law. But even before the bill is enacted into law, I believe, like I just stated, the right to privacy judgment in itself gives or makes a right to privacy a civil right. Not just a fundamental right, it is also a civil right. So, obviously before the government puts in place any safety or security measures, it is very difficult for common citizens to because it's very difficult to identify as to where the breach is happening, right? Yeah. Because it's all happening in the network, and you actually do not know whether it is the network provider who is doing it, whether it is the data collector who is doing it. It's very difficult to understand. So unless and until there is a mechanism put in place by the government, by the state, it is very difficult for an individual or me as a citizen or common citizen of this country to identify where my breach is happening and to thereby attach an accountability.